Ladies and gentlemen, unless you've been living under a rock, chances are you've probably heard about this, the new Ryzen 7 9800X3D. It's reviewed incredibly well, it's an awesome gaming CPU, and as long as you do have a suitable graphics card to actually back this thing up, you're going to love the performance and it is going to be excellent in your gaming PC. But there's actually something that's changed under the hood that not a lot of people are properly talking about, and that is overclocking, because the old X3D chips were locked down, they were restricted, there wasn't actually too much you could do with them, but the new one is fully unlocked. So if you do want to get even more performance out of your chip, then you can do it. I think I smell an overclocking session, everyone. So join us as we show you hopefully how easy it is to overclock this and give you all the results and all the temperatures and everything you need to know right after a short word from this video sponsor. MSI's new Core Liquid I series have arrived, bringing awesome all-in-one cooling to the masses. Thanks to the pre-installed fans, just 2 cables to connect for the radiator block, and a uni bracket for both AMD and Intel, installation is a breeze. The cooler looks awesome too, with its eye-catching dual-sided infinity mirror and RGB fans glowing up your rig, in addition to the awesome CPU cooling performance. Learn more about this incredible all-in-one today with a link down below. Rightio then everyone, let's talk about the big thing that is overclocking. And as I say, with the 7800X3D you could turn on PBO, but other than giving it more power, it wasn't going to change things dramatically. And the main reason for this was because you actually had the 3D V-cache that was actually on top of the CCDs, on top of the die, and this just limited what you could do with the frequency. You probably noticed that the frequency of the chips were running lower than the other chips in the 7000 range, whereas with 9000, this has been changed quite dramatically actually. The 3D V-cache is on the underneath, and this is one of the things that makes it actually able to be overclocked essentially, in a nutshell. A lot more to it than that. But yes, these things are unlocked. So if you go into the settings, once you're in the BIOS, you can scroll all the way down to CPU core ratio, and if you've been overclocking any CPU in the last 15 years, you're probably familiar with this. This is quite the old school way of doing it. By default, it's set to automatic, but essentially you can sync up all of your cores. Look, so if you want to go for 5.5 gigahertz, you can put in your 55, let the motherboard do the rest, and hey presto, you've got a faster chip. Obviously there's a lot more to it than that, because just putting in a faster speed, it might work if you're overclocking it ever so slightly, but as soon as you start needing to change around with voltage figures and things, and you're kind of letting the motherboard decide for you, so some boards might be better than others, sometimes it puts in values that are too low, too high, and obviously it's all about system stability, because the reason we have these chips that have all of these parameters by default is because AMD have done extensive testing. They know the average of what these things can achieve, and they want to make sure that everyone has something that's stable, something that runs well, but without leaving too much performance on the table. And because different chips are going to vary because of the silicon lottery, actually overclocking these chips means that you're going to get different results depending on the exact chip you put in your system. If you tested 10, you might find that some can have extra frequency or some might need lower voltages. But it's all a game essentially of having the CPU to run at the fastest possible speed with the lowest possible voltage, so it remains completely stable but at the lowest possible temperature. And as I've alluded to, different motherboards are going to work in different ways. They're certainly going to look different to this if you have like an MSI or a Gigabyte board. But the main thing really that you're going to want to do if you want to get the best performance without really changing too many things at all, step one, everyone really should be doing this, and that's to enable your XMP or your Expo profile on your RAM, because if you don't do this, then your memory probably isn't going to be running at its full rated speed, which is going to cost you quite a lot of performance. But also then, depending on the motherboard that you're using, when you enable Expo, and I'm fairly sure this is going on with this Asus X870E Hero board, it kind of does some enhancements and overclockings out of the box anyway, because you've kind of said to it, I want to overclock my system. That's what overclocking the RAM is, right? It's still overclocking, and as I say, it does some other enhancements as well. But the main thing really, and the easiest way to overclock your system, is to go all the way down and you find the setting called PBO, or Precision Boost Overdrive. And this is going to take the, what's the word I'm looking for? Guardrails. I almost said headrails. You want to take the guardrails off of your CPU and allow it to consume more power, because in its default state, this actually doesn't really use, relatively speaking, that much wattage, especially whilst gaming. We found it was about 58 to 60 watts or so in Returnal, and this obviously means that the temperatures of the CPU are pretty low as well. So in theory, you should have some good headroom for actually doing some overclocking and putting some more voltage in it. But if you go into PBO, then this is pretty much going to do it all for you, right? And this is where we're going to start. So we go over to Precision Boost Overdrive. We'll literally leave everything else automatic other than having our Expo profile on, and we will set this to enabled. We'll then go and save and exit, and then our PC should restart, and then essentially we've done some overclocking. Don't worry, we'll get more advanced throughout the video, but I just want to show you how easy it could be, and you can do this with any CPU to essentially get more performance out of it. But how much performance we're actually going to get just by turning this on remains to be seen. The quickest and dirtiest way to actually test our system for stability is to just run Cinebench at the maximum, essentially. You can leave it for 10 minutes or so, but there's loads of different tools. I'll leave a few linked down below. And then obviously you need to actually monitor your clock speeds, and you also need to monitor your temperatures. And rather annoyingly, core temp seems to be bugged with this particular CPU. So we're using this for our thermals on our power, and then I'm also using CPU-Z to actually look at our clock speeds and voltages and things. But as editor Carl will be screaming at me right now,
why didn't I just use hardware info? That would have been so much easier. It would have shown you everything all in one go.
So yes, hardware info is probably the way to go. But for now, we're just going to open this up, and we're going to see what this does. And as you can see, it has now sprung into life, and we can start to get our initial readings. And because this is going to run our CPU at max, we can get an idea of whether it's particularly stable. Again, you need to do it for a lot longer than one test to know whether your PC is stable, but you will be able to see clock speeds. And if there's like a big obvious issue with anything that you've done, it should show up now. So it's a good place to start anyway, and you can fine tune later. But with all of our temperatures and clock speeds and things, you can see it's running at 5.2 gigahertz, which is the same essentially as what it is in its default spec, but it does seem to be using quite a lot more power actually. It's now using 146 watts. So the TDP of this is 120, but we've unlocked it essentially. So it's now running at about 142. So we should be getting better performance just by enabling it to use more power, but there's definitely more in the motherboard you can do. But as I say, this is a very quick and dirty way that literally anyone can do because it's just hitting one switch. And because we are running this still at only around about 74 degrees with this 360 rad, you know you've got a decent amount of headroom too. But let's give this a restart though and show you how we can make that even better. Mash that delete key to get into the BIOS, head over to Extreme Tweaker, back into Precision Boost Overdrive, and the setting that I want to point out here because it's amazing, it's the easiest way to overclock your system properly, it is to go over to this one called CPU Boost Clock Override. Not sure if this is going to be called something different on other boards, but by default this is set to automatic, so our CPU boost is 5250 on this particular chip. But if you want to overclock it and get an even faster clock speed, that's the word I'm looking for, then you can go to enabled positive. You can set this to enabled negative and it will run at a lower frequency if you wanted to do that for power reasons. But for performance, we want to set this to positive. And then the only thing I don't like is that we have an absolute max, it seems, of 200, which is 200 megahertz, 0.2 gigahertz. So it's decent, but I think if you could set this to a higher limit, that would be a lot easier. My thinking is that maybe anything more than that, the thing can become unstable, but isn't that the point of overclocking? But I have a feeling this should run stably without needing to do anything else. So again, that's just one setting that I've changed. So what we've done is to increase the amount of power that's going into the chip. We've unlocked it with PBO so that the voltage is going to change depending on what the CPU needs. And obviously we've raised that ceiling so we have an extra 200 megahertz of performance. And this is what's going to make a difference, hopefully, to our games, as long as it runs stably. Well, we've made it into Windows, which is always a good start. Before we do anything else, again, make sure you have your monitoring software up, because especially if it's stable but it's just going to consume too much power, you don't want to risk damaging your chip. I mean, in theory, it should downclock itself, but especially if you're messing about with manual settings, you are quite literally taking some of these restrictions away potentially. So always check what's going on with your chip. CPU-Z can now be opened. Once again, Carl's going to moan at me, but core temp is being opened again. And then let's run our old friend Cinebench. But back into Cinebench with our monitoring software, we can obviously get this running and show you what it's all about. We're using slightly more power actually now, 154 watts, so an extra 10 just by making that change. But interestingly enough, our clock speeds haven't actually dramatically changed. Because this is all dynamic, while we've given it the option to go higher, it doesn't necessarily mean that it will. So at the moment it's, what's that, 5.25. So that's actually the same clock speeds. This is why overclocking can be a bit confusing. But let's give this a restart and then go back into the BIOS, and I'll do my best to explain essentially what's going on here, because it is very difficult to get your head around. This is unapologetically a novice video. As I say, this is the first Ryzen chip I've properly overclocked. overclocks, because I want this to be relatable. I mean, there are loads of other overclocking guides out there that will be able to show you everything in intricate detail. But if you're like me and you aren't a traditional overclocker when it comes to these Ryzen CPUs, I kind of wanted to make this more for you, really. But what's essentially happening is that what we've done is we've told the chip, well, take the power limits away, and if you want, you can clock all the way up to this speed. But the problem is that the CPU has set rules for how much voltages can be applied at different clock speeds. And in the default settings, clearly, it doesn't want to use enough voltage to get to 5.4 gigahertz. That could be wrong, but that is my understanding. So the way to get around this problem is to go back into the BIOS and then refine this setting back in PBO, scroll all the way down till you find this thing called Curve Optimiser. And this essentially changes how much power is required for a different clock speed, okay? So this is what is gonna fix our system, essentially. I say fix it, this is kind of where most of the overclocking actually comes in, because remember, overclocking is trial and error, and so far we've kind of just taken the guardrails a little bit. We haven't actually told it specifically that we want to overclock, right? So if we use this thing called Curve Optimiser, we can set either a per core or all core overclock on the Curve Optimiser. So again, do we want to change the rules for specific cores, or do we want all of them to be in sync, essentially? We're going to say all cores because this is an 8-core chip, but especially if you had like a very large core cluster or something, you might want to tweak this individually. One of the benefits by having a higher end board, especially like this Asus one, is that it will give you a little bit more information about each core. It kind of uses AI, and well, everything uses AI now. Essentially, it can look at your cooling, look at your CPU, and give you a little bit of advice for how each core performs, different voltage suggestions, things like that. But you shouldn't necessarily need that. As long as you've got these core settings, quite literally, you should be fine. So the one I was playing around with earlier was a -20. So essentially, this is saying you need less voltage to hit a certain clock speed. 20 is a decent overclock, but it's not anything particularly crazy. But again, you still might find you run into stability issues. So if you're running an application and everything crashes, you can't get into Windows, any sort of problem that isn't what you'd call normal, this will always be the thing you'd want to go back and reduce down, essentially. So bring nearer to the 0 mark in order to get your system more stable. But I was playing around with this earlier, and it seemed that -20 seemed to be quite a good little sweet spot. So I will now save and exit. Remember at this stage that you might not even get into Windows if something isn't running properly, or you might not even get into the bootloader if you've gone way too far. So at this stage, it's really important just to monitor everything. You've now overclocked your system, so expect potentially some instability. If you're surprised, if you've got some university work or something, now's not the time to do it. Well, let's open up Cinebench again, and then we can start this test, and we can have a look at the results. So this is what I'm saying about core temp, it wasn't working properly. Apparently running at 1.4 gigahertz, not the case at all. But then down the bottom, we actually have our real results from CPU-Z, and as you can see, we are actually running just under 5.4 gigahertz. So bearing in mind the default of this chip was 5.2, we've obviously increased the speed by a fair bit. Now, no matter what chip that you go for, obviously, it's not necessarily going to be night and day, especially if you're already GPU bound in a game or something, then it might help the 1% lows, but this is never going to be like crazy differences, right? With an 8-core chip, I think you are going to see a decent difference, but keep your expectations in check, especially bearing in mind that obviously if you run into any form of instability, you do need to roll that back. This is going to be a bit of trial and error, but this is definitely going to be the easiest way to do it. But I'm interested though, what happens if we put in a -25? Is this going to make any difference? I mean, actually, yes, it does. Look, you can see our clock speed now climbing ever so slightly more. I think the max we could get would be 5.450, and at the moment we're getting around about 5.410. So that is not bad, is it? I mean, that definitely goes to show, as I say, that overclocking this, if you're not going to do it full manually, obviously can be pretty straightforward and fairly easy. And we will need to do more stability tests, but I think this is going to be quite a nice sweet spot here, actually. And we're still using about 150 watts of power or so. So again, for a 9800X3D, bad habit. For a 9800X3D, obviously that's a lot of juice, but compared to anyone that's had like a i9 in the last few years, this is still way less. Even an i5 unlocked, there's still way less than you're gonna get on those chips. So anyone that's got a decent cooler, you're going to grab a 9800X3D. As long as you're okay with the risks of overclocking, we can never recommend it to everyone. But if you're happy with those risks, especially when it comes to instability, it's definitely worth having a go. But should we jump into some games? I lied. I want to know what happens at -30. What happens to my voice then? 30. I haven't tested this one, so who knows? But our clock speed at 5. I knew it. I knew it. -30 is no good. Of course, it is definitely worth noting that just because my chip didn't work at -30, it doesn't mean that yours won't, but then also because mine did work at 2025, yours might not even hit that. We don't know, but then there is also some other things you can do as well. The main new thing really with 9000 is this thing that they're calling Curve Shaper. So this just allows you to fine tune it a little bit more. So you might find that in certain applications like Cinebench, you're not going to get it stable, but then it might be able to run fine, for example, in certain games. It's almost a way of fine tuning that. So in certain loads, you can have slightly different settings so that you have a system that's more stable across the board, rather than having to have like different profiles for certain applications if you want to extract the most out of every single scenario. But yes, let's set this back to 25 and then fire up some games. And actually the first game I want to start off with is going to be a bit of an interesting one, because this is not your typical CPU test, right? Because this is 4K ray tracing max, which, as we saw in our previous video, if you haven't watched that by the way, where we give you full benchmarks, you can find that in the top right corner of your screen. Usually you want to turn the resolution down and settings down to low to expose all of the differences, but my opinion has always been that overclock your CPU, get a better CPU if you need it, and if you're playing games that you don't need it because the settings you're using are GPU intensive, save yourself some money. But actually what we have here is a bottleneck, or so it appears at least, on the CPU even with these settings, because our GPU utilization is around about 92 to 95% or so. So it's nothing crazy, but this is exactly the sort of game that I would probably do an overclock for, because at the moment you're just kind of leaving a little bit of wasted potential, essentially, a little bit of FPS on the table, when if you actually had a better CPU or you overclocked it, then obviously you could increase that frame rate slightly. I mean, it's still not crazy. I mean, if you want even higher frame rates, then you want to turn off the ray tracing entirely, right? Except actually, no, not massively. That's given us an extra 10 frames a second or so. But as you can see, that GPU utilization has actually dropped now. I mean, ray tracing, a lot of people don't realize this, but it is actually pretty intense on the CPU as well. So I'm not surprised by these results, but unless it is specifically a Dragon Age thing, something to do with the engine maybe, it does appear that even overclocking the mighty 9800X3D, as I say, does leave a little bit of performance on the table, but it does seem to be running quite well. Seems as if our frame view is bugged though, which is not ideal. I mean, it is fascinating though, because turning this down to 1080p, our frame rate has actually gone up, which we wouldn't usually expect really to see if it was just a CPU bottleneck. We're at around about 170 FPS now. But I mean, our utilization on the GPU has dropped to about 77, 80%. So there definitely is a bottleneck. And when we have a look at our CPU utilization, you can see that's actually anywhere between 86% and around about 60 or so. So our core utilization is pretty high across everything, even without too much really going on in this game. So I definitely think this is one that is going to be CPU dependent, and having a better chip will yield better results. I mean, this is something we will properly test, but certainly seems to be running quite stably, doesn't it? Let's bring up the full stats though, so you can actually see what's going on. Like we saw in Cinebench, still around about 5.4 gigahertz. That's 5.42 actually. In terms of power, that is now a lot more. I mean, remember in Returnal, granted that's a different game, but in Returnal we were using about 60 watts. So the fact we've jumped up to pretty much double at around about 118, that is something to bear in mind. It will cost you more to game on an overclock system. And in terms of thermals, we're looking at 69, nice, degrees on the CPU. I have actually set this to quiet mode now, so make of that what you will. Pretty quiet though. By far the easiest way to break this down for you is going to be with some proper head-to-head before and after overclocking benchmarks. So I'll bring you those in just a second, but before we get there, I do want to show you the most CPU demanding game I think we have. Again, high settings, ultra 4K with DLSS, Hogwarts Legacy, because again, this is another game, well, more so really than Dragon Age, that actually leaves quite a lot on the table. And as you can see, even with this in its overclocked state, we're still getting stutters, and we're still running this at around about 80 to 90 FPS. You can use frame gen again, that will sort of bring up the FPS, but I kind of wanted this as an illustration that whilst you may well get better performance out of this, I mean you should if you're overclocking it, and obviously you're getting better stable clock speeds, but it's still not necessarily going to be night and day, and this is with an RTX 4090, so if you upgrade to a 5090, then it's definitely going to be worth doing this if you're happy to obviously, again, take the stability risks and everything that comes associated with overclocking. But I think there is going to be quite a big disparity between the amount of GPU power that you get with the amount of CPU power. It's going to depend entirely on what you play, but something like Hogwarts Legacy does illustrate that if you are running into a CPU bottleneck, then just throwing in an even more powerful graphics card isn't going to help you. But we found the opposite problem with a lot of the tests when we did our full benchmarking on this, where most of the games were actually GPU bound. down. So it's all about having a balanced system, really. We've done so many videos. If you actually want to see a really good balanced system for this, then I've already made this video. You can find it in the top right corner of your screen. But essentially, don't overspend on the CPU. Maybe consider doing things like overclocking to save yourself a bit of money and putting a lot of the money into the graphics card. But yes, get a balanced system. Now let's move on to the bit that matters though. As I say, head to head, before and after. How much difference does this make? Let's hand you over to the one, the only, Benchmarkus. Thank you for the kind words, Mr. PC Centric. Always appreciated, but I have been doing a little bit more overclocking for you and actually have the hard numbers. But I'm going to start off with some Call of Duty Warzone, and I will begin this by saying I did cock up a little bit, apologies, in the previous video. There is a 250 FPS cap on by default, so make sure you turn this off. It's not going to affect your 4K gameplay, it's not going to affect 1440p Extreme particularly. You are going to be going above 250 from time to time, but you're still a blend really of GPU and CPU bound. But what I really want to get into here with this cap disabled is the 1080p low numbers, because this is really going to expose the differences. And in something like Call of Duty, you may well choose to play like this, right? I mean, each their own. And interestingly enough, if you actually turn off all of the enhancements, which essentially just disables the boost clock, then there's a massive difference. We're talking, what's this, like 30, 35 FPS or so. So huge. The CPU is now more power efficient, so this is going to work better if you're in like an RTX rig or something like that. But most people wouldn't use this. I just wanted to kind of have this as a baseline. Stepping this up to the settings that you're much more likely to be using though, which is Expo, but all of the memory speed have been the same, but none of the enhancements have been disabled. And here you can see we're getting just under 300 FPS when things really start to get intense. I mean, it's going to vary. If you want to play like, I don't know, in the Gulag or something, you can get close to 400 FPS at times. It's pretty ridiculous, but actually when you're in the city, a lot of buildings, a lot of things for the CPU to do, you're looking really anywhere between about 280 and maybe 305 FPS. So it's quite a boost actually by turning the 250 FPS cap. Apologies for that one, but good, because I'm sure there are people watching this that didn't actually know about this either. But is it going to make that much of a difference? Well, in the test that I did, no, not really. I mean, we're going to start with the most positive one, which was Dragon Age Vanguard. It's actually Veilguard, but you get the point. We went from 174 all the way up to 180, which is a pretty decent improvement. And actually, because this is a little bit more real world, because as I say, this is a game that's pretty intense on both the GPU and the CPU, then this is good. But when you look at the 1% lows, they were all kind of within margin of error. And because this isn't a built-in benchmark, there is a full chance that all of the FPS was essentially going to be the same anyway, and it did only increase just because it was margin of error. Moving on to another brand new CPU dependent game, we have some Planet Coaster 2. I was expecting big things and we quite literally saw nothing. This is still an engine thing, clearly it's being weird. It didn't make a difference with any of our CPU configurations. Shadow of the Tomb Raider, well, I use this because it's boring, but it is a very good indicator of the CPU performance. And once again, there weren't really any big differences. I mean, there definitely was, because we were GPU bound to a lesser extent, but again, going from 353 to 357 is definitely margin of error. But to be fair, the 1% lows did pick up quite a lot in this game actually, and this is kind of the point really that we're getting at here. It's not necessarily going to help you a lot, but because this is quite an easy thing to do, unless you are afraid of overclocking, then obviously you can get this extra performance without really doing anything. I mean, in Cinebench we did actually see quite a decent improvement across the board. I mean, I think it's quite obvious at this point that just turning on PBO alone doesn't really do anything with this particular chip. It might matter in some of the others, but here you do need to tune it up to actually get that extra performance. But a decent bump, but again, it's not going to be night and day. And then in terms of power, thermals, all of those things, it didn't really change that much actually. I mean, I've added some base numbers that don't have any enhancements whatsoever, so it was running at that lower clock speed. And this was quite a dramatic difference actually in terms of temperature that we saw and the power utilization, but it was quite a lot less performance, so I guess this makes sense. But otherwise, not like drastic differences really. I mean, Dragon Age actually surprised me because this was using quite a lot more power than we saw in our Returnal tests, but again, I guess this makes sense because it's utilizing more of the CPU. It's pretty CPU dependent, so obviously is going to use more power, but certainly nothing to worry about across the board as long as you do have a decent cooler. But yes, I would have liked to see some more. I mean, I'll quickly show up some numbers that I saw Jay's 2 cents actually had, because they were a lot more dramatic, but obviously with those games and those settings, it's not necessarily something that a real world user is going to see. So it's good that the extra performance can be there, but obviously bearing in mind that for real world use, high settings, high resolutions, other than maybe some extra 1% lows, it's not really going to make any noticeable difference, but it's a free change that you can make. So there you are then, folks. Quick and dirty, like my catching abilities. Obviously, if you're going to overclock, as I say, it always comes with risks. The main ones really are just system instability, but especially if you're doing it fully manually, the old-fashioned way, then longevity of your chip is going to be something to consider. And obviously, if you are putting more power into your CPU, you can expect it to not last as long. But every chip is different. Every chip is going to give you different results. If you need more performance and you're running a particular CPU-intensive game, it's definitely going to be worth doing. But likewise, if you're running a CPU-intensive application, it may be worth doing, but remember that stability is going to be king, and a lot of those applications, especially if you're leaving it to run for several hours, you don't want to run, well, you do want to run it, you don't want to run the risk of having it like crash halfway. So it's something to bear in mind, but it is definitely worth playing around with if it is worth the risk to you. But let me know your thoughts on this. How did you find this? Was it useful? Are you like me, quick and dirty, or would you rather have listened to someone that has been doing this for years? Let me know down in the comment section below. Smash the like button if you've enjoyed this. Get yourself subscribed. And of course, if you do want to check out current pricing on anything featured in this video, you can find this full build listed down below. And while you're down there, why not check out the awesome new MSI Core Liquid i-Series. These incredible all-in-ones come in both 240 and 360 flavors in black or white and look simply divine. Not only are they super quick and easy to install, but thanks to the dual chamber pump design, enhanced copper base, larger microchannel and LDB fan bearings, you can pair this with a beastly CPU and still get awesome cooling and acoustics. Learn more about this gorgeous new cooler today with a link down below. But thank you guys so much for watching. We'll catch you in the next one.